38 days of agony inside what Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni calls a fridge. Bob Njagi and Nicholas Oyoo, leaders of the Free Kenya movement, disappeared in Uganda under mysterious circumstances, with the Ugandan police and military denying knowledge of their whereabouts, only for President Museveni to declare they were in a fridge. With the help of the two Kenyan activists, we assessed the contents of Uganda's largest fridge that contains, among other things, Uganda's perceived critics. In Tanzania, hundreds of youth are ending up in the dock, facing varied charges of treason for the recent chaos that characterized Tanzania's election. On the other end of the mouth, Tanzania is talking reconciliation, with the new Vice President Emmanuel Nchimbi saying President Samia Suluhu Hassan is extending an olive branch. Back home, ODM is celebrating its 20th anniversary with the confirmation of Oburu Oginga as party leader. The United Opposition and the governing Kenya Kwanza are out on the campaign trail ahead of by-elections as President William Ruto steps up his early campaign for a second term. Later on Some Sense, making sense on the true value of leadership. On Bonyo's Bone, look who is talking. Members of Parliament are discussing efficiency. On Kaikai's Kika, to swim in the Indian Ocean, what it would take President Museveni to own part of Kenya's territory. On my memo, Kenya's first world trip through a stalled road project in Nyamira. Yvonne's take takes a pause tonight. The news gang is here.
Here, of course, we have very good intelligence, and we know them. Like, for instance, we have got two Kenyans whom we arrested. They have been with us. I have their names, but I don't remember their names. They came. They were working with Chagulanyi's group. That they are experts in riots.
All right, this is the news gang. We have a lot to discuss, especially what's going on Komajirani. That was President Yoweri Museveni speaking earlier this week, admitting that indeed Bob Njagi and Nicholas Oyoo were in Uganda for 38 days, that no one knew where they were. Before we go to our panel to discuss this, if it's possible, I really want us to listen to Uganda police spokesperson denying holding the Kenyan activists.
I don't have any information to the effect that they are in police custody, nor do I have any information that they are accused by police. If I had it, I would volunteer it here without any reservations.
Okay, that was after there were several attempts to try and find out where they were. They had been in Uganda, remember? They were in Kampala when they were arrested. They gave a bit more detail about exactly what they were doing in Uganda before they were abducted. That's Nicholas Oyoo. Let's listen to him talking about their plans in Uganda and what happened.
We crossed the border on 29th. We met the group that we wanted to meet with because those are our comrades. They are our sister group in Uganda. So we went there and we met with them and a bit participated in some of their issues, which they were doing, the rallies that they were doing. And we left the place and started to follow up other issues that we wanted to do in Uganda. We were pursuing other business interests also. So what happened shocked us because the moment we were at Starbucks, I think you know Starbucks. Who owns Starbucks? Hiyo mnajua. Ni ya nani? Ni ya rais wa Kenya. That is where we were picked, ironically, coincidentally. In fact, for us it feels like there was a collision with this.
There was a collusion in this, mnajua ni nani. 38 days later, they were back home. The relief was evident on their friends and family. Don't forget that there were attempts, very many attempts. They thanked the media, activists, and Kenyans in general kwa kuinsist kuulizia wako wapi. And I'll start with you, Sam. The army, the police, the attorney general, the courts in Uganda all denied that they had these young people. In fact, the judge ruled that he termed it as voluntary disappearance. Oyo and Njagi. Let's not even talk about what the Kenyan government did or not do for those 38 days. Gituku, it was a revelation.
Right. It's first of all, it's good news that the two gentlemen are back home and safe, and at least have been reunited with the family. Of course, you recall what a harrowing situation it has been for those 38 days. The families having to call press conferences to speak and also to reach out in whichever manner that they could. A lot of efforts that have been made. Civil rights groups demanding for answers from different authorities, both in Kenya and outside, and of course at some point even camping outside the embassy of the Ugandan government here in Nairobi, but eventually ending up with at least the reunion of Oyo and Njagi with their families. It's quite a relief to get to this point. But at the same time, Jamila, it highlights the fragility of perhaps the relations between Kenya and Tanzania, looking into the question that Prime Cabinet Secretary and of course the Foreign Affairs Cabinet Secretary Musalia Mudavadi had alluded to just before the reunion of these two with their families. You recall that there was a letter that had been released by the Prime Cabinet Secretary communicating and complaining to his counterpart in Uganda, asking questions that more than a month after sending that letter, there had not been any constructive or progressive feedback as to the whereabouts of the two Kenyans. But at the same time, Jamila, you're also looking at the reality that, like you said, that the High Court in Kampala was very comfortable with the reports that they had got from the military there, as well as the police service there. It raises questions because you'd have imagined that in the Kenyan context that we're used to, if there are actually images of someone being arrested or captured by the men that we saw, believed to be security forces, you'd have expected that there would be a persistence by the courts. If you recall that question of the Kenyan who had disappeared for fear that he was going to be sought, I forget his name. But you recall he disappeared for some time. Then eventually he showed up. The matter had been taken to court. There had actually been an order from the High Court saying that the police must produce the young man. But eventually it ended up with the young man admitting that indeed he had run away to stay safe because he was fearing that people might be coming for him. He's saying that there are people that had actually raided his house. So you can see the persistence that you find in the High Court of Kenya. In the High Court of Uganda, it's the opposite, that you find the court siding with the state and saying that, like you said, voluntary disappearance. But then it tells you something. With admission now, because the only authority that has admitted ever holding these two is the presidency. Meaning, either the president was holding them or he knew who was holding these people. Of course, when you hear them speak, giving revelations that indeed the son of the president of Uganda, General Muhoozi, may have been involved. Of course, those allegations that they are raising and explaining how it must have happened while they were there, you have no choice but to believe what they're saying. But at the same time, it raises questions as to the disparities between Kenya and Uganda, and of course, our other neighbors in the East African community or in the East African region. One hopes that there will be progress into these matters because, yes, they are home, they are speaking, they're expressing the harrowing ordeal that they went through, but also I take great exception hearing from them saying that whatever Njagi went through when he was abducted by the Kenyan authorities was way worse than what he's been exposed to in Uganda. It just tells you the resilience of these two gentlemen and really shines the spotlight on the sort of the treatment, the attitude of the other African countries, the East African countries, when it comes to the matters of human rights.
Yeah, and it's worrying some, because now I'm sure there are fears about going to any of those countries. Yeah, for a Kenyan, Kenya, Uganda, unaogopa utashikwa. Kenya, Tanzania, because what's happening, Uganda, the sensitivities now are around the elections that are coming early next year. Tanzania, the situation they find themselves in, and we've seen in the past when activists, including Kina Boniface Mwangi, were arrested or abducted in Tanzania, and what they went through. But I want us to listen to Bob Njagi explaining the Museveni fridge, because that fridge analogy was very interesting to hear from the Ugandan head of state.
Perhaps this opportunity would be for me to plead to or rather to demand from the Ugandan government to release all the political prisoners that they're still holding in the camps. We have the brother to the Internal Affairs Minister, his own brother, the Minister for Internal Affairs, Mutafiri. He's looking for his brother. He was my bedmate. His brother has been in the same place for 4 months. The family doesn't know where he is. They think he's dead. I left him in the cell, and he asked me, Bob, he asked me to talk to you to make sure the message gets to the president, because the president is not aware about some of these things. It is the son, Muhoozi, who is undertaking these crimes against humanity. They have been undertaken at the Special Forces Command Center in Serakasenyi. That is a training ground for the presidential security team. And they call themselves next to none, because they are next to none. They don't take command from any other, either the judiciary, whether it's parliament, whether it's the executive. So this is an armed militia that is operating under the General Muhoozi. And there are so many Ugandans. I left there over 150 of them in custody, people who are serving, who have been kept without going through any court process. They have been detained, some of them up to a year. That is what he's calling the fridge, if you want to know what the fridge is. So there are some people who are actually in the freezer, not in the fridge.
He talks about 150 people. These are mainly people who have raised voices of dissent against the government, who are finding themselves there. What I find interesting is what Njagi said about the brother of a minister being in there, and his family doesn't know that Yuko Hapo, and there are those who are in the freezer. It's pretty mind-boggling. Can we listen to Bob Njagi and Nicholas Oyo, if we can, before we continue, about them not being sure that they actually made it alive, and the relief of being back home after her horrendous 38 days?
38 days of abduction was not easy. We didn't think we were going to come out alive. We were being abducted by the military. We have been kept by the military in Uganda for this, under the Special Forces Command. We've not been eating for about 14 days myself. I've been fasting. It's been very difficult. The kind of food we have been given is not really food. We have been dehumanized, if I might say so.
We are traumatized, but we are happy to be home. I'm happy to be here. There are things I might have taken for granted. Today I may not take them for granted. And I believe that this is a moment, and all these moments are taking us forward.
Coming to you, JB, Otoli, pepo na jeshi, and from what they're telling us, things were really, really, really bad for them.
I think, Jamila, that puts into perspective probably why the judiciary in Uganda and the military police said they were not aware if they had these guys. Because the explanation from Njagi specifically says that this is a special force that operates under the command of General Muhoozi. And probably he is directly involved in this that the other arms of the state do not know. But it is tragic that in this day and age, very many years after African countries got independence, very many years after most of them became multi-party states, that we still experience such extremes. It brings me back to a report that was released sometimes in July, I think, that says the state of media and civil society in Africa has deteriorated in the last 5 years. And that report says that in the over 50 African countries, only 7 are safe for media and civil society. And none of them is in the East African region. So the 43 that are on the scale of 10 out of 10 in terms of clamping down on the civil society and the media, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania are firmly in the midst of them. And this is very worrying. Why is it worrying? Because for years, ordinary citizens rely on media and civil society when certain liberties are being withdrawn from them. But when states decide that the only remaining voice or protection or safeguard for the citizen, which is largely media and civil society, must go down this direction, then as a people, we really, really must worry about the future, because we don't see some of these leaders in these nations exiting soon. And by their staying in power, continued staying in power, then that portrays a very, very bad future for ordinary people. I mean, the East African Treaty, the way it was set up, I think it's article either 15 or 16, talks about promotion of democracy, protection of human rights, free movement of people and all that, what ordinary would call undugu. But in the last, I think, 3 years, that undugu seems not to be there. It's undugu within the states colluding to clamp down on civil society and media. Democracy is in question, because you look at what happened in Tanzania, look at what is happening to Bobi Wine in Uganda, you look at the things that are happening in this country, June 2024, you look at June 2025 in this country. So the state of civil society in the East African region is something that really, really needs a lot of attention. And I think we have a duty, especially as media, as Bob and Oyo rightfully said, that the voice of media must now come out strong and forcefully to try and pass this message across, because otherwise these people will operate as if we were in 1969, 1974 era. Mm-hmm. It is tragic. And
I do realize and that the fact that the media did keep the Oyo and Njagi story alive almost on a daily basis. The protests outside the Ugandan High Commission, at Bunge, whatever there was any press conference, I think the media really did very well in terms of keeping the story alive. And you're right about speaking out, Monyo, because when I was listening to the Ugandan president calling the two gentlemen riot experts, I was trying to understand what riot experts really mean, because there's this fear, I think, that is, or concern among, I think, such leaders that you talked about who have ruled for a long time, about what happened in Kenya spreading. Yeah. We saw it spreading. It did spread to countries like Bangladesh and Nepal and Madagascar. We saw a bit of it in Morocco. Yes. The Tanzanians actually did come out, the young people, and they're still speaking out. So there's that worry about what happened in Kenya spreading. But homa, it has spread kwa hao wengine. I think that's why we're called riot experts. But then now, this fear of African leaders, I want us to listen to Wiper leader Kalonzo Musyoka talking to African leaders and telling them, stop treating protesters as criminals.
African leaders must stop treating protesters as criminals. In the case of Kenya, in the case of my own country, senior counsel went out there, PLO, National Committee marched from prison to enter and defend young Kenyans who are charged under Prevention of Terrorism Act. The wave of Gen Z-led protests across Africa against bad governance, against corruption, impunity, lack of transparency, electoral fraud, and rising living costs.
He mentioned a very important word, defending. And it was felt during this whole period, the 38 days that Njagi and Oyo were abducted, no one knew where they were, that the Kenyan government did actually come out in their defense. I think I remember maybe after day 2 or day 3, the Interior Minister said something about them, and after that there was nothing. Until a day 2, when the CS Foreign Affairs released a statement and said he had spoken to his counterpart. Can we listen to the Prime Cabinet Secretary Musalia Mudavadi warning the youth against activism in East African countries?
In the last few weeks, we are also experiencing a situation where we are having a lot of interventions for young people. The moment you step beyond Kenya's borders, it's not the Constitution of Kenya that applies. You enter a sovereign state with different regulations and different laws. My prayer is that our young people, as they enjoy their freedom, please be cautious. It is absolutely important. We don't want to lose any Kenyan. We don't want to have any young life obstructed.
And then we had the Nandi senator speaking in church. Let's listen to him.
Wezi enda kwa nyumba ya mtu unaanza kukorogana. Mimi nataka nimuulize Mheshimiwa Samia Suluhu Hassan, Mheshimiwa Museveni, I want to ask President Museveni and President Samia Suluhu Hassan, if you get any busy bodies activists who want to destabilize the sovereignty and the peace and tranquility of your country, finya hawa, warudishe nyumbani tuwamalizie.
Speaking at a pulpit at a church, KAG church. The next day the church actually distanced itself from what he said, but alizungumza akiwa kanisani, and then he speaks again on Monday akisema, I don't regret matamshi yangu. What I said. Linus.
I think one of the things that we've seen this week is the country's diplomatic stature was put to test. What does Kenya look like? And unfortunately, this is not the first time. More suave and clever diplomatic players have been doing this, and Uganda has particularly been playing this game for a while, especially President Yoweri Museveni, who is very, very experienced. He's doing how many years now in office? Close to 40 years in office. And they say that diplomacy is an extension of war by other means. Mm-hmm. So when you look at how he handled the events of this week and even previous related events, you can clearly see that there is an imbalance here, because compare Uganda with the remarks we've seen there from the Senator of Nandi, Cherargei. And you can see, again, also our Foreign Affairs Cabinet Secretary advising our youth to behave well out there, without actually considering the fact that if they were to look at the Ugandan interference with Ugandan politics by Kenyans, it's actually been two-way. And he spoke about Bob Njagi and Nicholas Oyo, advising them to, vijana to behave. Let's remember that these two gentlemen were in Uganda at the same time as a pro-government team was in eastern Uganda campaigning for President Museveni. Kenyans, so when the CS speaks, he should not forget these facts exist. That, so it's dangerous for them to be out there attending an opposition event, but it's safe to go to the east and campaign for the government. Generally, we are not doing well on the diplomatic front. There is a mixture of naivety that has really seeped in, and our more agile neighbors are actually taking advantage of that and in a big way. But back to Uganda and President Museveni's remarks and explaining where the two activists, the two Kenyans were. When a head of state says they're in a fridge, what is this saying about the state of rule of law? Yeah. Where does this fridge sit in the entire scheme of statehood? And some time back, I sat and interviewed President Museveni, when we were in a different assignment, Jamila, down the street. And I asked him what he thinks about critics who say or who compare his style of rule with that of President Idi Amin Dada. And if there is something that ticks off, really makes President Museveni annoyed, it is the name of Idi Amin. You can't bring it up. And he just told me, he just says that you are not serious. I'm not serious. But when everything comes to a close, because it will, it's run 40 years since 1986, one of the questions that will be asked is whether President Museveni has left Uganda in a better state than he found it in 1986. The truth is, the emergence of this security bureaucracy that actually runs the country, and not security in the sense of civilized, and I used the word civilized in my interview with him, and we had a bit of back and forth about civility. Because when you have the military running dungeons, illegal arrests, abductions, and that is considered okay, the president comes and says they were in a fridge. That is not too far from what President Idi Amin Dada used to do. President Idi Amin used to run, he called it the State Research Bureau, SRB, and they used the Nile Hotel. That was the fridge of the 70s. So how different is the Nile Hotel, which was Amin's fridge, from this fridge whose name I don't think we have established yet, that is run by the Ugandan security services. Like Bonyo said, we are experiencing a general decline in across the region, not just in freedoms and in democratic rule, but also even just basic civilized ways of running modern states. These dungeons are really 60s and 70s, and we are seeing them coming back. And a head of state says it's a fridge.
Yeah. President Museveni and President Paul Biya have been in office longer than some people on this table have been alive, but these are only details. Gituku, do you have anything to add?
Speaking of which, I find it fascinating that there's that point that Njagi and Oyo are raising, that General Muhoozi acts on his own, that no one else that they report to. But then the president himself admits that they have very good intelligence. He has the names, only that he cannot recall them. That is quite telling, but also says that those two are working with the Changulanyi's group, which is the group of Bobby Wine. I think it's, again, like we've been saying the past 2 shows or thereabout, it's a moment for the East African community to reflect what really brings us together. What are we serving? Because when you keep insisting that one of the key considerations is the freedom of movement of goods, labor, and of course the people themselves, whether they are going to work or not, but that is not happening. It's a serious question that I would imagine that the summit would have to look at, the East African Legislative Assembly would have to look at. When these leaders, what do they be speaking about? I know there is the Council of Ministers that have also sessions. We have our representative in the East African community. Indeed, we have a cabinet secretary in charge of East African community affairs, with a whole department with the PS in that department. I think it's time that we relook at the treaty that binds us or that forms us, and see what is it that we need to work on. Because in as much as the neighboring countries, including Tanzania, has been saying that don't bring your bad manners into that country, how about when the Kenyan people get into those countries that they're being mistreated? Is it part of the agreement? Yeah. Recall that in this country there has been people who are foreigners who have been caught in the wrong. What happens? They're deported. They're not tortured and locked in for several days, or what the president of Uganda is calling the fridge. I think we have to have that serious discussion, because even if these Kenyans were there doing all manner of things that the government of Uganda decides or deems unsuitable, we have a rule of innocent until proven guilty. That is the Kenyan expectation. And even at the very start, you've seen the statement by the Cabinet Secretary for Interior Affairs, Kipchumba Murkomen, saying that the government has a responsibility to protect Kenyans in the country and outside this country. What does that mean when you're reflecting on how they're being mistreated? What do you need to change in our relationship? So really, it was pretty telling. And again, for what the cabinet, the senator for Nandi is saying, it is quite fascinating that you'd actually say that and repeat it in a press conference. I think it was at the Senate of Kenya. I don't think those are words that should be coming from him. He should be giving us solutions, not really drilling in the pain that these two have been subjected to.
Look, Sam, the impression right now is that the three East African nations, I know the East African community is now bigger with more members, but the three original members of the East African community, that is Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, at a government-to-government level, are working together in basically doing the same things. This is the impression they need to dispel, because it's becoming really strong. At least among the activists and the political opposition, there is a strong feeling that what Museveni is doing, Kenya is aware of. What Samia Suluhu Hassan is doing has been okayed by Kenya. That is the general impression, which is a very sad meeting point, because these East African nations never necessarily started off as friends. The ideological differences were really big in the 60s and the 70s and even the 80s. And talking of Uganda, between 1987 and 1990, the border tensions were really, really high, to the point that troops were deployed. President Daniel Arap Moi at this end and President Yoweri Museveni, yes, he's been
there
president
for that long.
Yeah. They deployed troops along the border between 1987 and 1990. A lot of tension. And this tension ended in 1990 when a meeting was held in Amagoro Primary School, somewhere in Teso, to just discuss trade and regional integration. Because in terms of integration, we can't do without each other. That's why we can't afford a day of political tensions, let alone military tensions that we were seeing in the 80s. But ideologically, and this is where past leaders really stand tall compared to current leaders, there were serious challenges that they had to navigate, including the fact that President Yoweri Museveni was revolutionary socialist leaning, whereas President Daniel Arap Moi is a conservative, and Kenya was a conservative Western leaning nation. So there were more delicate things to balance in those eras than there are right now. I mean, in those years, you would not find a place for the kind of remarks that were made by the senator of Nandi Cherargei. He wouldn't find a place because it was so complex. It is high-level diplomacy. It is complex. It's just an adult's game, which unfortunately I don't think it is these days.
It's not an adult's game anymore. Yeah. And this week has been very interesting in Tanzania. I know since the elections we've had, this week they swore in the members of parliament, they elected a speaker. Today, President Samia Suluhu Hassan named a prime minister in parliament. There was also now Chadema leader Tundu Lissu was brought to court. The first day he was supposed to be there, he wasn't brought in. There were issues about security. Then he was brought to court. Then there were the others in Chadema who were released, including Deputy Leader Heche. They were also asked to arrive at a police station. So there's a lot been happening, I think. But one of the main things that happened this week is that over 300 people in Tanzania who are facing the highest crime in the country, and that of treason. And it includes social media influencers, TikTokers. There's the lady Nifa, who apparently was asking people to buy masks so that they can be able to protect themselves from tear gas. She's also facing treason charges. There's several of them. Of course, the Tanganyika Law Society is offering pro bono legal services for the arrested persons. Treason, adhabu ya treason in Tanzania, as in many places across the world, is liable to conviction to suffer death. That's Penal Code 39. Any person who, being under allegiance to the United Republic, in the United Republic or elsewhere, murders or attempts to murder the president, or in the United Republic levies war against the United Republic, shall be guilty of treason and shall be liable on conviction to suffer death. That's the fate facing over 300 people in Tanzania, most of them between the ages of 20 and 30 years old. But then now, in Kiswahili tunasema shutma, about what has been happening in Tanzania is actually now picking up, not just in Tanzania, but also internationally. Let's listen to the UN Human Rights Office on the killings in Tanzania.
That security forces have been seen removing bodies from streets and hospitals and taking them to undisclosed locations in an apparent attempt to conceal evidence. We strongly urge the Tanzanian authorities to provide information about the fate and whereabouts of all those missing, and to hand over the bodies of those killed to their loved ones so that they can be given dignified burials.
You know, from the word go, I remember after just the elections, there were claims about 700 people had died. That was from the opposition, yeah? And there have also been people saying that we don't know where our loved ones are. There have been claims of people being buried in mass graves in Tanzania. But then we talk about voices now speaking out. Can we listen to the Archbishop of the Dar es Salaam Diocese, Archbishop Ruwaichi, talking about how nchi yetu imepoteza heshima?
Wako watu waliouawa wakiandamana. Lakini adhabu ya kuandamana sio kifo cha risasi. Wako watu waliouawa wakiwa majumbani, wamefuatwa wakauawa wakiwa nyumbani kwao, na taifa letu limepoteza heshima kutokana na yale yaliyojiri wiki ya uchaguzi mkuu.
Gentlemen, there's a lot to talk about in Tanzania, including President Samia Suluhu Hassan's offer for an olive branch. The word used was maridhiano by her new deputy president. We'll come back with the discussions on Tanzania, what's been happening this week, and of course we'll also talk about what's happening in Kenya in our local politics when we come back. This is the News Guide.